So, 30 years leading the most important...
32 years or 3 years.
33 years leading the most important advertising group.
Or what became it? Wasn't at the beginning. It was just a wire basket.
Yes, you were the
was
founder.
A wire basket manufacturer. Yes,
okay.
that's right. That's
you
right.
were the founder.
That's right.
What do you think?
Well, two founders actually. I had a partner at the beginning. To be fair, yeah.
What do you think about that model? It is still the model of the present and the future, or it's not more because we have a different system with a data-driven society?
Well, it's not just data. I mean, there's a lot of changes going on. So I guess that model has to change. I mean, all the companies that embrace the phrase or are tarred by journalists as the agency holding model are all similar. They're all going, there are probably about 6 of them. So it would be WPP, I mean in order of size, WPP, Omnicom, Publicis, Dentsu, IPG and Havas. So those are the 6 holding companies. And those companies are all going in the same direction. They're all unifying their companies, but it's a question of the speed at which they are unifying. They do lots of things for clients. And people are trying to pull those activities together in various different ways. So one end of the spectrum is sort of splintered and separate and silos, and the other end is integrated. And you can make judgments about where, I would say, the most splintered, if you like, or disintegrated is probably Omnicom, I would say, probably. The most integrated probably is Havas, because it's the smallest and therefore probably was the easiest to integrate, but it's now part of Vivendi, so it makes it I think what Vincent Bolloré calls an advertainment company, so advertising and entertainment. And then the other 4 are somewhere in between. Dentsu, because it is more a media and digital company, is probably to the middle, to the integrated end. Publicis has made a big drive, has a very good narrative of one Publicis. Whether it can deliver it in fact is another thing, and WPP is moving in that direction too, and they're all moving to one firm. They're all moving to one brand, one firm, and one approach. The question is the speed at which they do it. So that's the holding companies. The medium size and the small size and the specialist companies are probably trying to adapt even faster. I mean, they didn't originate in the old media, which is where all those 6 did. They started in TV and print, started in planning and creative, and media became more and more important. Then other activities like public relations and data and branding and identity and healthcare, and of course digital became more and more important. But a lot of the smaller companies and medium-sized companies have their heritage and their birth in those new areas of activities and moving increasingly to dominate those areas. So that's one set of challenges. So you have the holding companies which are changing their structures and moving increasingly to one firm, and then you have a number of other changes that are taking place which are pretty fundamental. Some structural, some cyclical. And the structural ones clearly are around the growth of the new media. I mean, if I look at WPP when I knew it last year, its media book, that's the media that it bought, was somewhere around $75 billion, and $5 billion of that, the largest amount went to Google. The second largest amount went to Facebook. You then had the traditional, if I can call them traditional media owners, like a Disney.
So which is the future of these companies?
Well, I mean, just carrying on for a minute on the digital side, Facebook and Google sort of dominate this in size. I mean, 5 and 2. The other traditional media owners, I mean, if you put Disney and Fox together, it gets to about $3 billion if they come together, or with Comcast probably would be similar with Fox. But the new media companies have tremendous power. And when I talk about the new media companies, I'm really talking about 7 companies. I'm talking about Apple, which may be the first $1 trillion company on the planet. I'm talking about Microsoft. I'm talking about Amazon, in addition to Google and Facebook. And then you have the 2 Chinese companies, Alibaba and Tencent, all of which are $500 billion companies. So they're 7 more than $500 billion companies. So these are immensely powerful. They have big revenue bases, big advertising bases in many cases, very strong margins. And of course, the problems that are being thrown up are, with power come size, and I often call them the Seven Sisters to liken them in a way to the energy companies of an earlier millennium who came under also great pressure because the power they have brings with it great responsibilities. So that's one big thing that's happening. Second big thing that's happening is the consulting companies are increasingly, it is said, encroaching upon the marketing industry. I don't think that's the case, and there was a very interesting interview with a man called Brian Whipple, who's the head of the Accenture consulting operation, where he said that what the consultancies don't compete with the advertising agencies or holding companies. They come into the top of companies at the chairman, CEO, CTO, CFO, CIO level, and they say to, if you were a CEO, you're going through digital disruption, you're going through great technological change, you're spending a lot of money on marketing. Let's look at ways that we can redirect that investment, invest in other things, and look at other things and reduce costs and pay us a proportion of what we save. So what he said was we don't compete because we get in up here and we're talking about projects covering 100 million or 200 million or 300 million dollars or euros, and not two rinky-dink $2 million or 3 million euro projects. So that's a second big challenge, and those are structural. Obviously, the growth in the media. I happen to believe that Google and Facebook are partners. They used to be frenemies. They became friendlier frenemies. They then became flexible friends. And now, because of the regulatory pressure, and we just seen in the newspapers this morning, Commissioner Vestager, having given one decision against Google, has two further decisions. And I was in America watching, I think it was 60 Minutes, where she said that she had evidence of illegal behavior, I think, with the phrase she used, by Google, and that she was, implied that she was going to go after them. So you have these two more decisions to come down, one in relation to Android and maybe the misuse of Android, and another area as well where Google may well be penalized by the European regulatory authorities. And the reason is these companies have tremendous power. So I would say they've tended to coalesce more with the privacy issues, with the Cambridge Analytica challenge that Facebook in particular is facing. They've tended to coalesce and partner more within the agencies and indeed with the clients than perhaps they had done before. So those are the two sort of structural things. The cyclical stuff, I think, and to some extent maybe the ZBB, the zero-based budgeting, so the Jab company, the Brazilians, the 3G company, which encompasses Kraft Heinz and Burger King and Tommy Hortons and other companies. These are companies that are very focused on cost. And in a world where economic growth is limited, where there's very little inflation, much more importantly, and therefore there's very little pricing power, there's tremendous pressure in the system, particularly in packaged goods. And that's exacerbated, finally, the fourth area, by the activist investors. So if you look at Procter & Gamble, the world's largest advertiser, Nelson Peltz is now on the board, has 1% of the equity, and is an activist for change. Dan Loeb at Nestle, again with 1% of Nestle, is an activist for change. Now, how much change will come as a result of their activities is another question. But all of these forces, those sort of four sets of forces, are putting pressures on clients and pressures on the agencies. And coming back to the original question, the holding companies have legacy structures, so it's much more difficult for them to change, to turn on a sixpence. They're rather like aircraft carriers versus motor torpedo boats. Now, it's true that, for example, at WPP, you do have some aircraft carriers, but you also have some motor torpedo boats. And the question is, how do you galvanize them and unify them and organize them into a much more nimble, agile, less bureaucratic, less overhead force to deal with the changes that the clients are facing? Because the clients, this, online, you can engage an influencer who has a following of 1 million consumers or 2 million consumers or whatever, and build a brand. I was up at Harvard Business School for my 50th reunion. There was a woman there who was running one of the beauty sites, Ipsy, which is, it's got considerable traction within the cosmetics, the beauty industry, by putting together bags of cosmetics for their followers and for their subscribers. Modern, fresh approach, very different to the traditional approach by cosmetic companies. And you see major companies buying these brands as they start to grow and they establish small market shares. So you have the attack, if you like, from the new media base. It's not just social media, it's search, it's e-commerce that is throwing up, if that's the right phrase, these smaller companies. And then in addition to that, in countries like China, in India, in Brazil, in Russia, in what Jim O'Neill, who used to be at Goldman Sachs, called the BRICS and the next 11 countries, companies are being born and developed in rapidly growing economies that are significant forces in and of themselves. And of course, with the trends that we're seeing against trade and the tariff barriers, my guess would be those companies, ironically, would become actually more important, because the pressure will be on as companies fracture, as countries fracture, the pressure will be on those companies to expand even faster in their domestic markets. So you see in China, the multinationals, there was a wave at the beginning where the multinationals penetrated the Chinese market very aggressively. They made acquisitions. But over time, the Chinese, who do listen and learn, and there are 1.3, 1.4 billion of them, so the law of averages would mean that, you know, they're going to be more successful than populations that are significantly less, like in Italy or in the UK or France or Germany. And as a result, these countries are going to become more and more powerful, and those companies are going to become more and more powerful and more effective competitors. So I went through a lot there, but there's a technological disruption, and then there are sort of structural disruptions, and then there are cyclical changes, all of which is making life, it's making it complex and it's making it difficult, but it's throwing up tremendous challenges. And I have to say, you know, having been out of WPP, let's say, for now 6 or 7 weeks, it's clear that you know, if you're not a prisoner of a legacy or a partial legacy, because, you know, if I looked at WPP, there was $20 billion of revenue, and there were parts of it that were growing and parts of it that were not.
A company like WPP has had more influence on people and also on politics than Google or Facebook or Amazon have now.
I don't.
More or less, or totally different?
No, I think I don't think companies like WPP had great, tremendous influence, or have tremendous influence in that sense.
So we have never seen something like
no, I think
what we are seeing now.
You mean from the point of view of the technology companies?
Technology and influence of
well, we have
driving
seen,
informations and driving behaviors.
We have seen it. We've seen it before. You know, Nelson Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller, I think had $900 million in 1920 and gave away, you know, 90 to his family, and the rest went into the foundation, whatever the numbers were. So that would be the comparison to Jeff Bezos, you know, if you like, with his 100 billion now.
But has influence on communication and information, and, you know, designing mind of people.
Well, I think the tech companies have far more influence. That doesn't mean that the agency holding companies or the networks within them or the companies within them didn't have significant influence from a branding point of view, from a product or service point of view, or more importantly from a political point of view, if they ran campaigns for candidates. Of course they had influence, but I think the degree of economic power that you see, I mean, just look at the numbers. I mean, WPP is capitalized at $22 billion, and you have the tech companies, I mean, the smallest is 500 billion. So they're peanuts in comparison. Now, they have very large numbers of people. They're like countries or armies. You know, WPP had about 200,000 people in 112, 113 countries. If you include affiliates, you exclude affiliates, that's companies they owned 20 to 49% of, it was about 135,000. Still large numbers of people. And one of the things that people do sort of wonder about, or they're sort of miraculous, they think miraculous, is that Google and Facebook and Amazon and Apple, they do with smaller number of people, although Amazon, of course, has a large number of people for distribution.
Do you think Amazon is more powerful than Facebook, but we can't see because it's more in the shadow, the power?
Well, I think Amazon is becoming more and more powerful. I mean, Amazon is a threat, in my view, to Google, It's a twin threat to Google on search, because we know that Amazon already originates about 55% of product search in the United States alone. Amazon has 30% of the baby wipes market. Amazon has 30% of the battery market. So it's already in the US. So it's already very powerful as a search medium. And it's also very powerful, or becoming more powerful, I should say, as an advertising medium. It's probably only doing about 2 billion a quarter, so call it 8 billion a year, but it's rising very fast, whereas Google's at 100 and Facebook's at 40. And all three will go for the long tail. That's for the small businesses and the medium-sized businesses, just like Jack Ma and just like Tencent. So my view would be, we all talk about who's going to be the third force. And people talk about Snap, people talk about Twitter, people talk about Oath and Yahoo and Bing. I don't think probably now any of the above. I think of the above, it's Amazon, the big three, from a new media point of view, and a social and a search and an advertising and e-commerce point of view. The big three in the West, at least, will be those three. In the East, Tencent and Alibaba probably pose even greater threats, because if they become more and more active outside China, which they are, they embrace everything. I mean, they're not Google, they're not Facebook, they're not Amazon, they're all of the above. I mean, they throw everything. And Ant Financial has just gone public at a market cap of $150 billion. This is the sort of little twin to Alibaba at 500 billion. So you're talking about massive companies. Ant on its own would be 7-8 times bigger than WPP. So these are very, very powerful companies, of the like of which we have seen in similar contexts, like the energy companies, but not on this scale. And I remember one head of an investment bank in America saying, he was asked who's going to be the first $1 trillion company, and he said whoever, I think it was Apple, he said. And then he was asked who's going to be the first $2 trillion, and he said there won't be one, because no nation state will let them become $2 trillion. I mean, you think about the Chinese economy is 10 trillion, the American economy is 20. So, rough orders of magnitude. Japan, I think, is about 6. Germany is about 5, I think. France, Italy, UK, all around 2.5, 3.5. So you're talking about very, very big companies which have immense economic power and potentially control sectors of the economy, as the European regulators seem to suggest.
What do you think about blockchain power? I mean, people who build blockchain tell that they want to disrupt government, banks, but also the centralization of those companies.
Well, I know,
and they will destroy Facebook. And Google.
You were at MIT on the weekend, so you know everything there is to know. I was at the business school, Harvard Business School, on the weekend, and I know nothing about blockchain. No, there were some sessions on blockchain, but interesting you asked me that, because I did see a blockchain company last week in the US. Really interesting in the media field. And if you just take that as an example, here was a company that was suggesting that publishers should deal directly with clients. So it was looking at the very, when people map the digital ecosystem that WPP is a part of, or our new company S4 Capital hopefully will be a part of, it looks like a complete mess. And you have the ANA in America, which is the National Advertisers Association, complaining about lack of transparency and opacity, and nobody knows, of every dollar that passes from, client to publisher, only X percent, let's say half, ends up in the hands of the publisher, and it gets taken out by other people in the chain. If the objective, as I saw in this case, of the blockchain technology was to remove all the links and to make it a secure transaction, which was much more fluid and, interestingly, was paid much more quickly. So, when the client ordered the media, the publisher would move much more quickly because it was just a direct link and it was a secure link, and that payments could be made. Because one of the biggest issues that we've seen for agencies is payment terms. That, as the pressures on big companies, particularly from activists and from private equity as well, to improve returns on capital, there's been a deferring of payment terms, and suppliers are asked for 60, well, it used to be somewhere between 30 and 60. It can be 60 to 90, 90 to 120. I've seen and heard of 180 days. And that puts tremendous stresses and strains on, particularly on the small and medium-sized companies. Bigger companies can deal with it. But blockchain technology in that particular case, and I think in many cases, would speed up the flows of capital and money within the system. Remove a lot of
disrupting the companies.
Yes. I mean,
of those companies or not.
But disrupting the existing digital companies. Well,
yes.
I find it very difficult to believe that Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple have not examined that technology in a very sophisticated way, and have started to adapt. But do I think it's possible for somebody to disrupt with this technology established industries? Yes, absolutely. Just like digital has threatened, if you like, 3D printing in the manufacturing area, has disrupted manufacturing processes. Robotics have disrupted manufacturing processes to a very significant degree. Now, of course, when all these things start to happen and things get compressed, and the frictions get taken out of the system, the political ramifications are very, very high. I mean, you look at what's going on in India on distribution, right? Just so, not blockchain, but distribution. You see the war going on between Flipkart and Walmart and Amazon, etc. And of course, a lot of money being, I think Amazon said they were going to invest another $5 billion in India. The political implications of that, when you think about it, are very significant, because so many people in India rely for their livelihood on retail or wholesale distribution. And politically, that's a very important constituency. If they get thrown out of work over a short period of time or a medium period of time, as a political force, they're going to be very disruptive. So the sort of things that you see going on, I mean, globalization, which I think generally people believe has been to the benefit of man and womankind generally, but has some side effects which are extremely unpleasant, namely in mature economies, in manufacturing industries like automobiles, which historically provided large levels of employment. That employment shifts to lower cost places like China or India, or gets eradicated completely. So you have to re-educate, retrain, and society has to subsidize those people put out of work. I mean, there has to be more of a realization on that. So the sort of things you're talking about with this blockchain, improvements in retail distribution and like have massive, in my view, massive social consequences, many of which, we're sitting here in Italy, for goodness sake, and we look at the political implications. I mean, who would have thought that the right and the left would unite in some way, shape or form to form a new government? A Russian populist and right-wing populist and left-wing populist. I mean, it's extraordinary, and I don't think even you would have forecast that, a year ago? You would have probably have said it was, maybe I'm wrong, maybe you saw it coming.
What do you think about?
I don't know. I don't know enough about it to opine, and I'm a foreigner here, so I shouldn't say that.
Last year you met our political
I met
leaders.
some of them.
Yes, but would you have imagined that this year?
I would never have forecast it. No, in the same way, I mean, we did on Brexit. I mean, when it was Cannes a couple of years ago, the advertising festival, and we did have a poll from our pollsters, the WPP pollsters actually, which forecast the result precisely. The Trump result, I think we were all very surprised about. True, the voter turnout was low, which is part of the problem, because people have become so apathetic to politics. They feel they don't, and the young, for example, didn't vote on the Brexit referendum, which is why some politicians say, the people. Well, one politician in the UK said, the people who voted for Brexit were the people who were going to die, not the people who were going to live through Brexit.
In Italy, we had the problem with the referendum that we had not the young people profiled, for example. Does a company like WPP have profile people?
Yes.
So you could have an influence on it.
Yes. Well, we could certainly, and have done. I mean, there are parts of WPP that have worked for various political candidates and parties in various parts of the world. So the answer, I mean, we're coming back to your question about do those companies have influence? Yes, at levels they do. But of course, the whole Cambridge Analytica scandal is around the sort of thing we're talking about. And when you get into areas of artificial intelligence, in particular, we're all worried about whether the bad guys will get control of artificial intelligence devices which will enable them to do all sorts of naughty things. So the things that you see on the movies or on television or on Netflix may become more realistic than we thought, and sooner than we thought, because some of the things that you see in virtual reality
Do you think artificial intelligence is the power of the future?
Well, if you said to me, what do I think is going to be the most troubling force for our clients, particularly our packaged goods clients, it's voice. So the voice-activated devices like Alexa, like Google Home, like JD.com's Ding Dong, or Genie, which is Alibaba's voice active. So every one of the 7 companies I mentioned, I think have voice activated devices or will do. So these are concierge services, if you like. Most people use them. They come in and say, Alexa, play when our baby goes to sleep. Play baby music. Mm-hmm. But so it's not being used in a sophisticated fashion yet. But it's a form of artificial intelligence. I think voice is probably, to my mind, will become one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful. Because, so for example, last Christmas, it was amazing. There was a price war between Amazon and Google. I mean, what Amazon were trying to do was a real estate battle. They were trying to get you to put Alexa in every room in your house. So wherever you go, you would, if you say, I need a meal, or I want to go to the theatre, or I need a car, or whatever it happens to be, Alexa. So I think actually that's probably, and now how you keep brands in the front of the consumer when they can, I mean, I remember being on a television program and saying, Alexa, if I said to Alexa, get me the cheapest battery, Alexa will say Amazon batteries. And I was on air, and somebody emailed into the presenter of the program saying that Alexa had just ordered the batteries. So it's a very powerful. That's really powerful. So you don't, text starts to, it just becomes voice. Mm-hmm. That's immensely powerful, and it means that the relationships, and it has big implications for data, and therefore big implications for Amazon. Mm-hmm. I mean, I talked about search and I talked about advertising, and those are head-on challenges to Google, and for Facebook it's the advertising, not so much the search. But data and control of the data is really critical, and the people who have the biggest control and who threaten to have the biggest control is Amazon. And there are, without naming names, there are numerous examples where clients have gone to Amazon and they've said, we'll go on your platform as long as you give us or share the data. I'm aware of one where they went on the platform, they agreed, went on the platform, get on the platform, and Amazon refused, and they come off the platform. So this battle for, it's, if you went back in time, Walmart, Tesco, Carrefour controlled the retail shopping experience, and the manufacturers were sort of more distant, so they had to advertise over the heads of the retailers, if you like. Now you have the internet, which enables you to establish a direct relationship between the manufacturer and the consumer, but coming in the middle of that is what I call the e-tailer or the e-retailer, and Amazon and Alibaba and Tencent, who actually effectively are the Walmart, Carrefour, and Tesco of the new millennium. And there's this big battle that when Unilever buys Dollar Shave Club, it's not buying Dollar Shave Club because it wants to go into competition with Gillette and Procter. It's buying Dollar Shave Club because that gives them direct access to men and women. I think men were 70% of the subscribers on Dollar Shave Club, but the other 30 were women. So it opens up a platform. When Bob Iger says, I want Sky, or when Brian Roberts at Comcast says, I want Sky, I think what they're saying is this is one of the ways, if not the way, of competing with Netflix or Amazon Prime, which establishes a direct relationship with the consumer. So these, and data will be a fundamental part of that as well. So the battleground on data is going to be very significant.
Do you think that Amazon will create suddenly a cryptocurrency?
Well, I think there was something I read recently, I think in the last few days ago, that they are sort of messing about or thinking about that sort of thing. I mean, there doesn't seem to be anything that Amazon doesn't think about. I mean, the motto seems to be your margin.
Also, Samsung is mining.
Yeah, I think people are looking at what they can do, and the motto is, your margin, my opportunity, and disrupting the chains. So coming back to that blockchain example where I said, you had publisher and you had client, and what they're trying to do is figure out a way of disintermediating everybody in between and making the process in the end much more simple, much more effective, much safer, much more secure. So I think those sort of things will happen, and I can't see anything stopping Amazon at the moment. The only thing I can see stopping Amazon is regulation. I mean, that it gets, people say that Apple will be the first $1 trillion company. I would be very surprised if Amazon is not the second.
What will be S4 in this?
Well, it's really an answer to your very first question. What is the optimal structure that you can create, given a clean sheet of paper, because we have nothing. Given a clean sheet of paper, what is the optimum structure? So it has to be much more agile. It has to be much more responsive. It has to be much more, much less layered, much less bureaucratic, much less fixed cost, probably much less account and planning, and more creative, but using the creative word not in the way that people tend to use it, at Cannes, or historically have used it at Cannes, to be fair, or within the industry. This is certainly not Don Draper creative or Mad Men or creative. This is creative in the broadest sense of the word, because you can have creative data analysts or software engineers. So it's using that word in the broadest possible way, with very few barriers between those experts and the client. The other thing is, I think, and this is a difficult area, I mean, clients want big change, rightly or wrongly. They want big change. You hear a lot of clients saying, what is the agency of the future? I mean, that's tell me what, how's it going to be structured and how's it going to be done? I mean, it's fully integrated. It's going to be more global and local and less regional. It's going to be able to deal with those local brands that I mentioned, and those brands that are bred by all the new media. So it's going to be much more flexible, much faster, much cheaper because of the nature of the marketplace. But in order to do that, the clients have to change as well. So the clients, when you talk about a new agency model, it's probably not a new agency model, it's a new client agency model. We sort of know what the clients want, and we sort of know the direction it's going to go, but both sides have to make the changes. No good the agency just making the change and then the client remaining exactly the same. So when people talk about agency silos, you can have client silos as well. So client and agent, so co-location is going to be a very important part of it.
And how did we change? I mean, the way we people, we perceive reality in different ways. How did it change, and how we perceive reality and news with data now? And so how can we be influenced in a way that we were not before?
You're getting into the areas of fake news and those sort of...
Fake society more.
Fake society?
A way of building a society. Have you seen the Adam Curtis documentary? The hypernormalization. We lived in this kind of world, and now we are influenced by other topics, and in another way, more personalized and so on. So what do you think about it? Did you ever think about the way people are changing their way of being influenced and perceive reality?
Well, I mean, you know, it's amazing how, when you look at what happened in the recent elections, from the analysis, it's amazing how people may have developed their perceptions, developed their views. I mean, you are getting into the area of quotes unquote fake news. So I think it is about it, because people take as gospel what they read on a page. I mean, you know, a blogger can be your mother. You know, a blogger can have. You can read a blog, and it could be being viewed by one person, written by one person and viewed by one person. You can read another one which will be viewed by millions of people. But you tend to take. I mean, obviously, you have views about the blogger or the relative merits of the blogger, but you tend to take as gospel what you read, just as when we read in the papers, in the newspaper, physical newspapers, or watched on television. We would tend to believe what we watched, what we saw, and what we read. Now, with all this information coming at you in various forms on different platforms, you do tend to take it not as gospel necessarily, but with greater degree of certainty than probably we thought possible. So it is dangerous, and it has to be watched carefully. I mean, it's not just the privacy issue. I mean, the privacy issue, to my mind, you solve by making sure the consumer really knows what he or she is letting herself in for. I mean, you know those things you have to sign, which are ludicrous when you go onto a site. You know, the pages and pages of close text, and you know, even if you get a lawyer to do it, it would take 2 months to do it. So what you do is you just say, I accept. And you don't know what you're accepting. That's wrong. You know, we would have loved to have things on an opt-out basis, i.e., you know, if I didn't want something, I opt out. So sort of inertia. But it's not possible anymore, because...
But we had also in the past systems like that. I mean, what do you think about the documentary hypernormalization?
Yeah, but now that's not possible anymore. I mean,
Yes, but it was as powerful as now in the past, referring to the documentary that we will show in our program.
Yeah.
What do you think about that documentary? It is really, or it is a forced vision of
No, I
the
think
past?
it's a forced...
It was like that?
Yes, but it was a forced vision. You said a forced vision.
Yes.
Yeah, it was a forced vision. That's what I would think. We have to see how it goes. I mean, it's very difficult to...
I mean, the history of last century was so different from what we have perceived from media, as hypernormalization shows. I mean, mass media created in the last century a vision and something that was not true, only to influence people. It happened.
Yeah, well, you could say...
You were there.
But you could say the same thing about what's happening now. I mean, you could say the same thing about, you know, various elections. I mean, we know that Brexit was influenced. We know that certain people spent more than the election limit on technology or electoral procedures. We know that happened in France because Macron called it out before the actual election. We think it happened in the German election. We think it happened in the Italian election. We think it happened in the US election. So, you know, that approach or that influence, obviously it's a different force today than it was 50, 75 or 100 years ago. But the same thing. I mean, you're saying we could have in the 60s or 70s created these or stimulated these ideas. I mean, if somebody didn't want something, it was very difficult to get them to appeal to it. But no, I don't think there's that much difference. It's just a different technology and a different approach. But you could argue that some of the things that have been going on in the last 4 or 5 years, particularly politically, have been engineered. And we that's one of the things that is really important to understand. And I think that's the root of European concern about the tech companies, that they engineer this control. It's their power gives them. There's some other things as well. I mean, you go to France, the French government will say, we're very worried that French companies don't understand digital disruption. And then the second thing they will say, I've heard this, is we're very worried that none of the platforms are French or European. They're all American. So where are the French platforms? Where are the German platforms? Where are the Italian ones? Where, here in Italy, we had an investment in H-Farm, H-Art, which is a sort of, I guess you could call it an accelerator outside Venice. And the problem with that was, it actually probably made more money on real estate than it did on the tech. Why? Well, because the market wasn't big enough. That was the common. Now maybe it will be, but we seem to have lost. Europe seems to have lost that battle for the moment between US on the one hand, and you were saying before there's differences between the East and West Coast, but forget about that for a minute. And then China.
Not direct democracy, but representative democracy.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is that right?
Yes, thank you very much.